Welcome back to part 4 of the Discover God series, and thanks for giving me your time and attention for this very important matter. And especially for us as Jews, we have to know that God plays a central role in Judaism, and therefore it's important to know not only that we believe in God, but what that actually means. And what I want to talk about today is the idea of having God be a priority in our lives. Now we know that as humans, we're granted this ability to decide what's important. We have the Super Bowl upcoming between the Broncos and the Seahawks, right, next Sunday, I guess, February 2nd. And some people, this is the biggest day of the year. This is the Super Bowl. This is the most important thing. And you have other people say, Super Bowl, I don't care about football or about the commercials, right? I care about collecting stamps or art or music or pop culture. Everyone has their mishigasin, and everyone is able to assemble for themselves a list of priorities. Right? Everyone can determine what's important to them in their lives. Now, it's important for us, in our journey of discovery of God, to recognize that the second that I come to the realization that God actually exists, He has to become a priority in our lives. Because if God exists, remember, it's possible God doesn't exist. Maybe yes, maybe no. Those are always the two sides. But if He does, He better be a priority. Because if He does exist, He's demanding something of us. So it's important for me in my life, right, to have number one, a more meaningful life, but number two, it's a requirement. Right? God is demanding something of me. Otherwise, He wouldn't have created me. So therefore, I have to make sure that God becomes a priority in my life. So that's the first thing we're going to need to do when we come to the realization that God exists. But I want to argue that if God truly exists, nothing else can have a higher position in my list of priorities. How could something be higher than God? Any ideal, even your whole life. My life is important to me, but how can it be more important than God? How could anything be more important than God? And actually in Judaism we have a term for that. That's called idolatry. The second there's some value, some priority that I have that's more important than God, well, God is beneath that. If God's beneath that, well, you're valuing something that's more than God. That's idolatry. So God not only has to be a priority, He has to be the highest priority. And the last thing will get you probably kind of depressed is that, in truth, if God exists and He's a priority, and we found a way to make Him the highest priority, we have to realize that in reality, God's the only priority. God's the only thing that has real value, that has essential value. Everything else has value only in a relative sense, only in relation to God. Only means other things can have value, like going to sleep. Right now it's like 10:54 p.m. So I'm gonna go to sleep soon. So going to sleep is a value. It's an important thing that we do in our lives. But I can ask myself, why is it important? It's important because I should have energy tomorrow to do God's will. And to be a good person, because that's what God wants. And to be healthy so I can fulfill God's commandments. And so I can be able to be awake during davening tomorrow morning, during prayer tomorrow morning, and preparing for Shabbat tomorrow night. Right? In a way, what we can actually do, or this is actually, I think, a high level. So, but for us beginners, maybe this is just something we should have, a conception of. But in a certain sense, there's this idea that everything that I do, right, even back to the aforementioned Super Bowl, I can watch the Super Bowl, but in my head I'm saying, this doesn't have its own value. I'm not enjoying this on its own accord, rather because I want to be part of a society. That's important because that'll help me to not be a hermit. Therefore, I could be more productive in my activities towards my ultimate goal, which is God. So everything, my eating, my sleeping, my relationships, everything does not have essential value. They only have relative value. That's the highest level. And that's what we're told about Abraham. Abraham, we're told that he had a book called the Book of Avodah Zarah, which is, we have a book in our Talmud called the Book of Avodah Zarah as well. But the Talmud says a very strange thing. It says that Abraham's book of Avodah Zarah, the book of idolatry, contained 400 chapters. While if you open up over here, see in the back of over here, I have a copy. Oh, it's really heavy. But I have a copy of the Talmud, and the Talmud's tractate called Avodah Zarah. And in it, it has 5 chapters. And why would Abraham need 80 times that? Why would he need 400 chapters for his book on the prohibition of idolatry when we have just 5? And that seems like it's more than enough. It seems to cover everything. So my grandfather once explained that what Abraham had was he enlarged, expanded the idea of idolatry. He said that idolatry is not just when I have a priority that's higher than God. Idolatry is when I have a priority that's independent of God. Any priority, any value in my life that is not valued in proportion, in association, relative to God, it has its own value. What do you mean? How can something have value irrespective of God? God's the only value. Everything is dependent on God. God's not dependent on anything else. So what he did is in that expanded book, Abraham demonstrated this very high, lofty goal or lofty status that man could attain, where everything has value only in relation to God. But for us, what was important for us to know, that what's required of us is, number one, to make God a priority in our lives, and obviously once we understand it, once it's rational, it's reasonable, we can prove it, we can argue with people who want to contest this fact, it becomes a priority. After it becomes a priority, we have to realize that it has to be the highest priority. Nothing can be higher. And lastly, we have to be aware that there is something called the state that Abraham had, where God is not only a priority, it's not only the highest priority, it's the only priority. And that's obviously what I'm trying to do, is expand the vistas of faith. So if we're talking about God and what it means, we should at least be aware that there is some level of faith that could be attained, at least theoretically, or at least it was attained by Abraham, where God could become a priority, it become the highest priority, it could also become the only priority. So our work is kind of cut out for us, and we could be successful, and I hope you and I could do this journey together. Thank you.